So former House Speaker Tom Foley used to have a joke that he would tell. Let me see if I can get it right. He would say, I have three rules about drinking. He would say, I don't drink alone, I don't drink before 5 o'clock, and beer and wine aren't drinking. And so this was the culture that dominated Washington for so many years. And my book begins on a night where this culture was in full effect, even though it was kind of late in congressional history, which is the night that the Affordable Care Act passed. This is March of 2010. All day long, you can actually physically feel the intensity of the moment because of the sound coming from the street. This is when the Tea Party was outside the Capitol, hectoring people. If you remember, John Lewis was called the N-word by Tea Party activists as he was walking to vote that day. It was warm, the windows are open, and you could just hear the shouting. But Democrats knew that they had put together the votes by then, and so they were boozing all day long. And so by the end of the day, when they finally put this on the floor and it passes, it crosses the 218 vote threshold, it was the most raucous celebration I've ever seen on the floor of the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, Republicans, probably also in their cups, started singing "Na na na na, hey hey hey, goodbye," believing that this was the thing that they were going to ride back into the majority. From the House floor, the Democrats all kind of marched down Pennsylvania Avenue that night. Now it's getting fairly late, and they stop at this dive bar called the Tune Inn. If anybody's from Washington, you probably know this place. And so the bartender who was working that night, this guy Manny, all of a sudden he sees his bar has been completely taken over by the House Democratic Caucus, and a 6'4" guy, bald guy from Queens, goes behind the bar and just nudges him aside, and he's like, I've got this, Manny. And that was Joe Crowley. Joe Crowley just starts filling pitchers, filling shots, leading the bar in song, chanting. The place is celebrating like the tune-in never had before. There was one other guy at the bar who hadn't been invited there, but this was his regular watering hole, and I saw him there, and he was quite annoyed that the rest of the Democratic caucus that was there. This was Raul Grijalva. So at the time, he was the chairman, the co-chairman of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He had voted for the Affordable Care Act, but this was after threatening that he would not do so unless there was a public option in it. He'd organized a bunch of other progressives who said, if you don't put a public option in this bill, if you don't make it a strong Affordable Care Act, then we're voting no. They didn't. He voted for it anyway. And so he said to me, well, we're celebrating and we're commiserating. And what he was commiserating about was the lost opportunity and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that continue to be lost every month, and the fear that he had that Democrats had missed their window, and that voters were going to make them pay in 2010, and eventually there was going to be a blowback that was going to wipe out all of their gains. As kind of Joe Crowley left the bar, Grijalva saw him and tried to wave to him, and Crowley kind of looked. I was right next to him. Crowley kind of looked at him. They looked at each other and just ended up not even saying anything to each other. This was the tensions were kind of under the surface at the moment, even at the height of the party's biggest legislative success in half a generation. And so kind of that moment is what I explore in the book and try to tell the history of the party leading up to that, so that when the window opens again, if the window opens again for Democrats, they don't end up just celebrating, commiserating, they end up only celebrating. And so I follow in the book kind of the two different threads that were present there in Crowley and Grijalva and are present today in the Elizabeth Warren, AOC, Bernie Sanders wing versus the more establishment wing of the Democratic Party. And I trace it back to the 1970s and 80s to try to identify what decisions were made and what could have possibly been done differently. you could start a history like this wherever you want, wherever you want. And in the question and answer, we can go back and talk about some other decisions and hinge points that might have been important that I didn't talk about. But here, I want to start with the critical election of 1980. One of the main characters in my book, kind of an antagonist, you could call him, is Rahm Emanuel, and he serves as such a perfect character for this story because he's been deeply involved in all of these historical moments. He was a junior in college in 1980 when he volunteered on his first House campaign. He's a 20-year-old kid, and within a couple weeks, they make him the head of fundraising because they realize that this kid has a particular gift for shaking rich people down for money. I talked to some people who knew him at the time, and they said it was just extraordinary. Here's this 20 or 21-year-old kid, and he'd see the Commerce Secretary and say, "Hey, bub, how you doing?" And give him a big old slap on the back, and by the end, he'd have some type of commitment of actual money coming from these millionaires and billionaires in Chicago. So 1980 is known in everybody's consciousness, of course, as the year that Reagan won. But one of the parts that is lost to it is the absolute, crushing devastation on the Senate side. So there were a net 12 seats lost in the United States Senate, and not just 12 seats, but 12 senators that had defined kind of what liberalism had stood for throughout the 20th century. These are people who had pushed the most significant environmental, labor, consumer protection, civil liberties bills throughout the 20th century. Names that we've heard of still today: Birch Bayh, Magnuson, even who's the Alaska senator who's pretended to run for president? Gravel. Even Gravel goes down in 1980. He lost in a primary, actually. Frank Church. These dominant names in the party. All of them repudiated, and they're thrown out using relatively new political tactics. This is the kind of Roger Stone-driven, or Roger Stone-branded, at least, television era, where Republicans are exploiting new campaign finance rules that have been put into place because of recent Supreme Court decisions, raising tons of money from corporate America, spending it on negative attack ads, 30-second ads, and just doing politics in a way that hadn't been done in a long time. And so people like Birch Bayh, Frank Church, Magnuson say to themselves, we've been in office 4 terms. People know us. People know us at the grocery store. They're not going to believe these lies that they're seeing on their television. That was not true. The people did believe the lies that they saw on their television. And so they still somehow managed to hold on to the House of Representatives, and that somehow is because they had this virtual lock on so many Southern seats. So you had this kind of functionally conservative House of Representatives. You had a Republican-controlled Senate, and you had Ronald Reagan in the White House. So House Democrats, who were the only ones left standing, they sit down to try to figure out what their path forward is going to be. And Tony Coelho, who's a California congressman who'd been elected just 2 years earlier, 1978, and would become a mentor of Rahm Emanuel, he proposes, look, we still control the House of Representatives, and we have not gotten serious about fundraising, and that's why we were crushed so badly in 1980. We can go to corporate America, and we can say, look, you're not going to get anything from us, but we control the House. So if you want your agenda to even get a hearing, there are new rules here in Washington. You're going to have to ante up. We're going to create what he called a PAC strategy, which today we just call fundraising. And 1982 rolls around, and so Coelho becomes chairman of the DCCC, which at the time was a complete political backwater. So they'd say, go ahead, take a shot at this. 1982 comes around as people probably remember, this is the year of the Reagan recession. It's the first midterm after a presidential, so there's naturally going to be some type of a backlash. And so, as you'd expect, there's this blue wave in 1982, and Democrats tell themselves that they've cracked the code, that they've figured this out. It was this strategy of raising corporate money, getting up on television, and that brings them back to power. This is happening despite the ongoing decimation of organized labor. You know, the 1981 PATCO strike, where Reagan just fires all of the air traffic controllers, doesn't hurt them in the midterms. Organized labor is still there for them as much as they can be in their weakened state, and so they figure, okay, this is it. We've got the remnants of our old coalition. We put together enough corporate money. We hire the right consultants. We get up on television, and we can go toe to toe every 2 years with Republicans. And this then becomes kind of the dominant Democratic strategy over the next 20 to 30 years. The second thread that I write about is the one that is kind of running counter to this, and I start that thread in Chicago in 1983 with the insurgent mayoral race run by Congressman Harold Washington. So the Daley machine is trying to take back control of Chicago in this 1983 mayoral race. The younger Daley is running. The father had died in the late 70s, and Washington, along with Jesse Jackson, decide that they're going to try to put together a coalition of white working class immigrants and black voters in Chicago that's going to change Chicago politics. The Daley machine is trying to just kind of reconstruct the old Daley machine. During the race, Jesse Jackson gets wind that Walter Mondale and Ted Kennedy are planning to come to Chicago and endorse the Daley machine. And so Jesse Jackson calls Ted Kennedy, and he told me that he said, look, I'm not trying to get you to back Harold Washington. I understand that's out of the question for you. But look, you have no idea what we've accomplished so far on the ground here. We're registering tens of thousands of new voters. The energy on the street is palpable. You can feel it. Just stay neutral in this primary and just see what we can do on election day. And Ted Kennedy said, I'm sorry, Daley's are old family friends. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing I can do. We're gonna come in and endorse. And if you think about it, the Daleys did in fact kind of steal Illinois in 1960 for his brother and make him president. So when it comes to debts, that is a fairly significant debt. But to Jesse Jackson, that wasn't the point. That was 23 years ago. They come in anyway and they endorse Daley. Washington ends up winning the primary anyway. They registered some astounding number of new voters in the city on this strategy that, look, you have all of these people that can vote, but they just don't. Give them something to vote for, and they will come out. After the primary, the Democratic machine switches sides and endorses the Republican in the general election, and not the kind of weird behind-the-scenes quiet help that some officials give to some Republicans in races when they don't like who the Democrat was. This was an explicit, out there door-knocking public endorsement of the Republican candidate by the Democratic Party in Chicago. And so this insurgency had to take the race to the general election. They end up winning this race. Washington ends up winning the race by just 4 points. So this is a city that is something like 90% Democratic, but it shows you how competitive you can make that if the entire party establishment switches sides in the general election. This was, to me, such a useful race to to study because it gets to the question of party loyalty, of ideology, and just how far some elements of the Democratic establishment can be to protect their own interests. Because if you think about party politics from a self-interested perspective, if you're a member of the Democratic Party establishment, you could argue that a Republican win is in some cases better for you personally than a progressive Democratic win. So look at it this way. So if the Democratic establishment candidate wins the nomination and loses the general election, well, the Democratic establishment still is in control of the Democratic Party apparatus at that point. If a progressive or insurgent candidate wins the Democratic primary and then goes on to win the general election, your whole crew is out. Everything, the entire ecosystem that you have built is now pushed aside. If the insurgent wins the primary, but the Republican wins the general election, then you as a Democratic official can say, look, see, we warned you that these people were unelectable. There was no way that they were going to win the general election. They've screwed it for everybody. You have to put us back in charge of the Democratic Party. And so out of the three outcomes, the one that can be most damaging personally to the advancement of some officials is actually the progressive Democrat winning the general election. And the 83 Chicago race is one of the few instances where you actually saw that, where you actually saw them kind of act on it in a very explicit and public way. And so from there, Jesse Jackson eventually decides that he's going to run for president in 1984. Gets in very late, but does surprisingly well that election. And so he decides, okay, I'm going to run again in 1988, but I'm going to do it in a serious way. I'm going to get in early. I'm going to put an actual campaign together. I'm going to try to get real endorsements. Kind of similar to how Bernie Sanders ran on a lark and on a messaging campaign in 2016, did surprisingly well, and then tries to run a serious, real campaign for the nomination in 2020. And what surprised me when I went back through the 1988 election was just how close Jesse Jackson came to seizing that nomination. Toward the very end of the race, after some of the hapless candidates like Joe Biden or Al Gore had dropped out, you're down to just three. You're down to Dick Gephardt, Michael Dukakis, and Jesse Jackson, and they come into Michigan. This is 36 caucuses and primaries into the general election, and all three of those candidates need Michigan, all for a variety of different reasons. Jesse Jackson stuns the political world by just blowing both of them out in Michigan. The next day, Dick Gephardt drops out, and now Michael Dukakis and Jesse Jackson are ostensibly in a delegate tie at this point. The next election, the next primary a week and a half later is in Wisconsin, and Jesse Jackson's polling well ahead now of Dukakis in Wisconsin. And if he wins Wisconsin, there's the very real threat that he just rolls it up from there. And so it's one of these moments where, as you were living through it, and if you were paying very close attention, you're like, wait, this guy that everybody thought was just running to send a message is now within striking distance of actually winning this nomination. The articles that were written in the Post and the New York Times in the week and a half or so after that are a sight to behold, because it's a full-blown Democratic establishment meltdown, happening in public view, on the record quotes about the end of the Democratic Party as we know it, practically the end of the world as we know it, if something doesn't happen that stops Reverend Jesse Jackson from winning this nomination, and instead everybody getting behind the more electable candidate, Michael Dukakis. And so over the next week and a half, there are there's just blow after blow after blow that rains down on Jesse Jackson, and the polls in Wisconsin end up being way off. He loses Wisconsin, and from there, Michael Dukakis kind of sews up the nomination, and he obviously ends up getting smoked then by George H.W. Bush, who was, as you remember, not terribly popular. And there were so many Democrats running in 1988 because Democrats assumed this is a Democratic year. Whoever wins this nomination is probably going to win the White House. That didn't happen. So what I get into in the book is what has changed about Democratic insurgencies since the 1980s that could make the outcome of these races different than they were then. So in 1988, when Jesse Jackson stuns the world by winning Michigan and demonstrating to the country that he could actually win, he had no easy way of translating that moment into fundraising. Like there wasn't any. Mail certainly isn't going to work. You can't get your mail pieces together fast enough and get them out to people and ask. And he couldn't go up on stage and say, go to jessejackson.com and donate $27. There's no text messaging campaign, no email that he could blast out and instantly raise $10 million. But that has completely changed, and to me that has changed what's possible for left-wing candidates like this, because now if something like that happened to a Jesse Jackson, all of a sudden they would be flooded with several $1 million from people from around the country that he can then take and dump into the field in Wisconsin and door knocking and text messaging and try to keep the momentum going. But without that ability, you can't quite pull it off. In 1992, Jerry Brown tried the first version of this, and if you remember this, he had this 1-800 number. That was his innovation, and he wouldn't take more than $100. If you gave more than $100, they'd send the rest of it back, which led to this funny moment in a Democratic debate where he'd been told that he wasn't allowed to mention his 1-800 number, and so on stage he said something like, "And I just think it's utterly unfair that I'm not allowed to tell everybody out there that if they call 1-800 Jerry Brown, that they can make a small contribution, that I don't take big money, I don't take corporate money, but I can't tell you to go to 1-800 Jerry Brown. So unfortunately, I don't know what to do." So that was the first kind of attempt to allow this connection of a kind of disaggregated mass to pump money into a campaign, and it had some effect. Bill Clinton, it probably pushed Bill Clinton significantly to the left in his rhetoric. If you go back and look at Bill Clinton's 1992 rhetoric, you'd think he was going to be a fairly populist, progressive candidate if you only read kind of the speeches that he gave during the primary. But it was really the advent of the internet that allows this to take effect in a way that really threatens the big money decision that Democrats had made in the early 1980s. And so you first see this kind of burgeon with the Howard Dean campaign completely accidentally. Dean had no understanding of what was happening. His campaign manager, Joe Trippi, did, because Trippi had strangely gotten involved in these pump and dump stock schemes in chat rooms, where these different people would float, hey, take a look at this stock, and then they'd spread it out using the internet. They would raise the price of it, and then everybody in the chat room would sell, make a bunch of money, and everybody who had bought would lose their money. So Joe Trippi is getting involved in these kinds of schemes, and so he saw the power of the internet to move things in a quick way, and he winds up finding a way to kind of translate that into the Howard Dean campaign. And Dean wasn't a terribly progressive candidate at the time, but he's scanned that way to a lot of people. He's from Vermont, so people assume he must be liberal. He was a doctor who was for universal health care, so that's another check. And he was against the war, and he was one of the only major Democrats at the time who was willing to proudly be against the war and willing to stand up to President Bush, call him a liar, really give Democratic voters what they wanted, which was somebody who was willing to fight. At heart, he's really a balanced budget kind of centrist, but those pieces were enough to fire up grassroots Democrats so they could pump. So they pumped a ton of money into him. Ultimately, the primary electorate decided he wasn't electable. It was, people think it was the Howard Dean scream, but he had lost before that. And if you remember the moment that the bottom really fell out for him was when he said that Saddam Hussein had recently been captured, shouldn't get the death penalty. And Democrats, who mostly agreed with him probably, said, well, that he's going to sound too weak. That he's going to sound like some lily-livered hippie, and we're in a time of war, and so we need a veteran. We need somebody who has the kind of credentials that Republicans can't smear. And so they go with the electable John Kerry. And of course, we know how that worked out. A ton of people who worked on the Howard Dean campaign and developed a lot of those innovative strategies for him around small dollar fundraising went and built up the Obama program. I won't get too far into this, but the difference between say an Elizabeth Warren or a Bernie Sanders campaign, which is purely small donor based, and Obama's, which was about half small donors, half Wall Street big money, was that when he came to a decision point of which direction he was going to go in, whether he was going to kind of do kind of a grassroots movement that was going to try to change the political calculus in Washington, try to shame Republicans into supporting a more robust stimulus to get people back to work, to go after Wall Street, to get a tougher health care bill, or if they were going to do a more insider game. He was able to lean into the big money and go with the insider game. Rahm Emanuel, by this point, is his chief of staff, and he had the kind of the political support there from Democratic elites to make that decision, whereas a leftist candidate who only has small donor support is kind of forced into the decision that a lot of people in the Obama campaign wish he had made instead, which was, after he wins the election, to say, here's the 4-point agenda that I'm going to take to Washington, a stimulus that's going to put everybody back to work, not leave 10% unemployment hanging through 2010 and into 2011. We're going to do something about the foreclosure crisis. We're going to do a tough health care bill. We're going to do climate change legislation. And I want 20 million people to sign up to support this. He already had a list that big. The thinking among some of his campaigners was that if he would have done that, you just barrel into Washington. They were completely afraid in Washington of this grassroots army that he had built up, and you could see how members are movable just by the bailout vote that went the other direction. Remember, the first time they put the bailout on the House floor, it failed, and the stock market tanked. And then a week or two later, they put it back on, and it passed that time. And so there were people in his campaign that were saying, do that with a stimulus. Put a $2 trillion stimulus that puts everybody back to work on the floor. And Republicans are saying that they're going to defeat it. Go ahead, let them do it, and let the stock market tank, and then use this grassroots army that you've built to pressure them to put it back on the floor, and then pass it. We don't know if it would have worked, but this wasn't a strategy that was tried, and so that's the new idea that a Warren or Bernie Sanders are trying to bring to bear this time around. Now, so I want to leave some time for questions, and I'll say one last thing to get us up to kind of 2018, 2019, and then if there and then I'm happy to take any questions about this, the current presidential race, what's going on in Congress, or kind of the period that came right before that led to a lot of these decisions. So that one of the themes of the book is that a lot of these efforts that have been made to organize people to improve their lives have, in the short term, failed. They've come up short. They've been beaten back by corporate America, by the power of capital, by the Republican Party. But in so many cases, either lessons that were learned in that fight or people who learned lessons in that fight went on then very soon after to significant wins. And so you never really know exactly how something is going to turn out, even if it is a short-term loss. In 1983, when the Democratic machine endorsed the Republican in the general election, that inspired a young social worker in Chicago named Luis Gutierrez to get involved in politics for the first time. Before that, he had been, he'd followed politics, he'd voted, but he wasn't particularly agitated about it. But then when he saw that this guy, Harold Washington, who he'd voted for, was now being opposed by his own Democratic Party, Gutierrez decides he's going to jump into politics himself. He ended up winning a special election a couple years later, 2 years later or so, that kind of broke the back of the Chicago Council Wars. He then goes on to be a progressive congressman and representing Chicago, only retiring very recently. The Jesse Jackson campaign brought in a ton of people as volunteers who otherwise might not have gotten into politics, because when you're running a campaign that is inspirational, you are inspiring new people to get in. These are not just people who ran for student council president in middle school and then were in college Democrats and have always been planned on getting into politics. These are people who otherwise would just be on the sidelines. In 2015 and 2016, Bernie Sanders really didn't have a choice but to bring in those kinds of people. There were even vendors, basic vendors like that weren't even doing particularly political activity, who would tell the Sanders campaign, we're not actually working with the Clintons, but it's just not worth the risk of doing business with somebody who's running against the Clintons. And that was the same when it came to professional campaign staff. And so they wound up with this very eclectic Ocean's 11 type crew of people who came from all different walks of life. One guy sold his food trucks. Another had to join the campaign. Another had been an organizer in community college out in California. Another was fed up with life in Silicon Valley. But there were effectively no real professionals kind of running, DC-style professionals running the organizing campaign. And as a result, they thought about things completely differently. And kind of under the nose of the campaign, which wanted to run a more traditional campaign where they'd use their small dollars and they'd buy TV ads. Despite all the talk of the political revolution, they had planned to just run it in a fairly standard fashion. We'll do television ads in New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina and Nevada. And this entire other department kind of finagled some budget money to build what ended up being called a distributed organizing platform that tried to answer the question, we have these millions of people who are giving us small dollars, but can we do something else with them? These are all, for the most part, talented, dedicated people. They're not asking to be paid. They want to volunteer for the campaign. How can we build a system that allows them to effectively participate in the campaign, whether it's door knocking, text messaging, without it being a traditional top-down field program that we simply don't have the money or the resources to run. And so they finally did figure out a fairly effective system. they didn't get it up and running really until January, at which point the race is effectively over. But most of those people then went out and formed a new organization, which eventually became known as Justice Democrats, which then recruited Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Bronx to run against Joe Crowley, and using this kind of grassroots innovative approach that they had developed in the Sanders campaign, ended up stunning Joe Crowley on Election Day and kind of transforming the way that the Democratic Party thinks about what is possible. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that people have. If anybody has any.
Who's getting the nomination this time around?
I don't know. Who do you think?
Do you think they can win?
I do. So my own assessment, for what it's worth, which isn't very much, because who knows, is that given that we're in a three-person race with Warren and Sanders and Biden all fairly even in the polls and in the ability to fundraise, it does start to come down to some things like mechanics and ability and talent. And I mean, the most obvious thing is that the polls show the most upside for Elizabeth Warren. There are the most number of people who say that they're considering her, that she's an acceptable alternative. There are the fewest number of people that say she isn't. I'm getting confused with my negatives and positives, but so when it comes to Biden, there are a ton of people who they don't want to vote for Biden. When it comes to Bernie, there are a ton of people who say they don't want to vote for Bernie. That number is the lowest when it comes to Elizabeth Warren. But on a pure kind of talent and managerial level, that may come into play as well. Warren appears to have more energy than either Sanders or Biden, but she's also a much better just manager of an operation. For all of Sanders' positive qualities, managing is not one of them. He for a very long time believed that kind of staff was kind of corrupting. That when politicians start relying on staff, those staffers have their own ambitions, and those staffers will try to work to moderate the politician in a way that might be helpful to those staffers' careers, but isn't to the people they represent or to the politician himself. And I think there's probably some truth to that general assessment, but you can't scale a political career on that alone. And so because he is kind of unwilling to delegate authority to a staff that he doesn't necessarily believe in as a construct, that leaves the staffers kind of unable to craft a strategic campaign. And if you look back at the Sanders campaign, you don't really see one. Like, you can think about 2016, what was the Bernie Sanders campaign about? That's clear. He was the main alternative to Hillary Clinton. He was opposed to the millionaires and the billionaires and the rigged system. And that, of course, carries through to this campaign. But beyond that, you don't quite see kind of what the narrative is, what the story is that he's trying to tell us, because he hasn't really been able to manage a campaign that puts together that sort of operation. And he's also missed a lot of opportunities that Warren has ended up seizing on just to win like news cycles for a day. Joe Biden, one of the big knocks on him is that he's always been kind of a lazy. I don't know how many of you personally know him, but he's just not that energetic of a dude. And he's 78 now. Is that right? He's old. So he was kind of lazy as a 45-year-old, and now he's 78. And so the campaign has said that, their strategy is to try to keep him away from voters as much as possible and hope that his poll numbers can just defy gravity long enough that he can kind of slip through Iowa and into South Carolina and then into Super Tuesday and be ahead and then just kind of stumble in to the nomination. And that's an entirely plausible scenario. That's probably their best case. Whereas Warren, she's a good manager of people. She's not raising big dollars, which she's made a big deal about, and so she's able to do all of these selfies. She has a big field operation that she's got going, and she has an actual campaign that she's running. So if it does end up coming down to kind of talent, then there's going to be a little bit of an edge for Warren there. And if Biden does fade, then it might be too late for the establishment wing. If the establishment wing wanted to find a replacement for Biden, they had to do it earlier, I think, because we're already now approaching October. So if he fades, they don't really have time to rally behind whether it's Kamala Harris or whether it's Buttigieg or Cory Booker or whoever kind of emerges as an alternative. It might be too late for them.
So I guess you lead us to the question, Jesus Christ, I can't even think of her name. How does she match up against Trump?
Warren?
Yes.
Well, so it really, so the question is, how does Warren match up against Trump? And it really, comes down to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Can she win there, or can any Democrat win there? And if they can, then they win the White House. So to start with, you want to look at why Democrats lost those in 2016. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough, and which is a hopeful sign for Democrats, are third-party voters. In Washington and in kind of political discourse, if you vote third party, you kind of have forfeited your right to be part of the conversation. You're just no longer discussed as part of what happened. And so as a result, you see 99% of the stories about vote switching being about people who switched from Obama over to Trump. But a roughly equal number of them switched from Obama in 2012, voting Democrat in 2012, over to voting third party in 2016. And so what a Warren does is she brings a lot of those people kind of back into the Democratic fold. And in 2018, a ton of those people did come back into the Democratic fold. So these are not the kind of diehard socialist voting candidate voters who just think the two-party system is utterly corrupt and they're never going to participate in it for moral reasons. Those are not the people we're talking about. These are people who demonstrably have voted for Democrats recently, 2018, 2012, but just didn't do so in 2016. And so if you craft a message like Warren's that aims at those people who were disaffected and tries to bring them back in, then you're crafting the kind of message that also resonates with some significant portion of the people who went from Obama over to Trump. So if you did the reverse and only targeted people who went from Obama to Trump, then you're missing a lot of those third-party voters. So Biden would be going after those people who switched from Obama to Trump. And you voted for Obama. You say, I'm basically Obama. He keeps talking about the Obama-Biden administration. So he's hoping he can pull them back that way. But that does nothing for all of the third-party voters, except for the ones that just really hated Hillary Clinton. And there's some non-trivial portion of those that are just going to come back if the Democratic nominee is not Hillary Clinton. So for somebody like Warren, in a state like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, if she can pull them back in, and she can kind of match the enthusiasm that Democrats saw in 2018, then there's no reason to think that they can't win back all three of those states. You know, they won them quite easily, actually, in 2018, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And then you have other states that will be in play in a way that they weren't necessarily in 2016, like North Carolina. We'll have the special election there tomorrow in the Charlotte suburbs, which is worth watching closely. That's the race, if you remember, that Republicans won by like 500 some votes, but then it was discovered that there was this consultant who had been fabricating absentee ballots, and so the election was tossed out, so they're doing a special election. And so the big fear among Democrats has been that all of this energy went into 2018 and it was all anti-Trump energy, and it was enough to take back the House, and now it's exhausted and it can't really, rise up again for the 2020 election. But if they can, hold steady in that special election, the suburban district of Charlotte, then that's a sign that North Carolina is in play, and also that the energy has not dissipated. The early voting numbers that I've seen actually outpace 2018 in that district in terms of the gap between Democrats and Republicans. So it does suggest that Democrats are still pretty fired up, but it'll be worth watching that race.
Can I come at it a little differently?
Sure.
The history of our union in presidential politics, both times Obama did somewhere close to 70% against McCain and Romney. Last time, and we were the first construction union to endorse Clinton, Trump, who was supposed to lose the election on election day, according to the polls, got 44% of our members. We saw a survey this afternoon, and I know it's a valid survey, that said most of our members still think he's doing a good job. And what do they like about him? One guy says, I have to close the door to tell you this because my wife and daughter will go crazy to the person surveying. Well, he delivered on what he promised. He calls it like it is, and we've never worked as much in our lives. So, I always refer to the 2018 election as kind of a big transformation from 16. But what's going on with people like ourselves, and that's not just this union, it's all the other building trades unions.
Yeah, that's right. And so, the Democratic Party is moving in a direction kind of away from those workers. They are. There were serious efforts made in 2018 by some of these more progressive organizations to run progressive candidates in rural white working class districts to demonstrate the prospect that you can win on this message in rural America, you can win on it in the suburbs, and you can win on it in the cities. Richard Ojeda running in far out West Virginia on a progressive populist platform as kind of a union man. He led the teacher strikes, the Wildcat teacher strikes in West Virginia, he organized the first meeting. He brought together mine workers and teachers, and the mine workers kind of schooled the teachers on the history of Wildcat strikes, how to go out. And his county, his neighboring county, Mingo County, was the first to go out on the Wildcat strike, with him leading mine workers and teachers together, and it kicked off this energetic campaign around the nation. The final weeks of the 2018 campaign, as you remember, were dominated by Kavanaugh and the caravan, and both of those issues pushed what might have been winnable races in these districts away from the Democrats, and made the Republican margins of victory that much bigger. Whereas in the suburbs, Kavanaugh and the caravan worked in the opposite direction, that it angered more suburban voters who were angrier at Trump, and it contributed to the blue wave. And so you do wind up with this coalition that's forming between kind of cities and suburbs against rural districts, which puts the Democratic Party in a position of representing some of the richest people in the country. You know, the very richest people in the country, who have, the billions and the billions. Those are still mostly Republicans, and they're funding the entire party. But then you have this upper middle class of kind of Whole Foods districts, as people call them, that are going increasingly Democratic, and that's going to have implications for what you're talking about. These districts are sympathetic to the concerns of the workers, but they're not workers. Who was the union leader who said it's better to be a friend of the working man than to be a working man? These are those kinds of people who are friends of a working man, but that friendship only lasts until there's tension, and there's a real threat that then those voters will go in their own class interests, particularly as cultural issues divide them. If you look, and none of this is very promising. If you look back at the 20th century history of the Democratic Party and the labor movement and the way that this unfolded, you find that this does not end well for the building trades. What was that famous protest of May 1970, when the hard hats in Manhattan down on Wall Street went to war with the hippie protesters, famously kind of beating up a bunch of hippie anti-war protesters, and Nixon responds by naming the head of that union that beat up all the protesters as his labor secretary, really leaning into this kind of culture war between kind of the rising new left and labor. And so in the 1976 election, there are all these cultural differences that are emerging between movements within the Democratic Party and labor invests a ton of its energy and resources into Scoop Jackson in 1976, who A, was never going to win the presidential election, B, was tremendous on union issues, great on economic policy, domestic economic policy, but C, the reason a lot of the union leaders liked him is that he was a hawk. He's the founder of kind of the neoconservative movement. He's the guy that Dick Cheney looks up to as kind of the original neoconservative. And for a variety of reasons that aren't worth getting into, the head was Kirkland at the time, was more committed to kind of anti-communist American foreign policy and supporting American wars overseas than he was in kind of elevating the American working class. And so Scoop Jackson stood for that agenda. And so all of this energy goes behind Scoop Jackson. He ended up with something like 2 million votes in the 1976 primary, not enough to win, but enough to matter. And George Wallace, running as a Democrat that year, wound up with something like 1 million kind of white working class votes in the Democratic primary. And so this is all of this. This is union power and working class power that's just kind of being burnt away on kind of cultural hostility toward the left and toward anti-war faction of the Democratic Party. And what it does is, instead of a progressive candidate winning in '76, you wind up getting Jimmy Carter, who then goes to war against unions as president, and you see that, and you see the war on labor that really kicks off under Reagan. it starts under Carter, and working people's wages have been declining ever since. My own take on it is that if you could go in a time machine and go back and change the minds of enough people, you would say to organized labor in the 40s and 50s, when the kind of compact was struck between major corporations and big labor, that, okay, we're going to be at peace now, and major corporations are going to accept the idea of organized labor, and we're going to negotiate, we're going to stop pushing for kind of improvements to the welfare state. We're not going to advocate for universal health care. We're not going to necessarily, we're not going to agitate for higher wages across the board. We're not going to we're going to support Republicans and Democrats. We're not going to kind of try to transform society through the government. We're going to just negotiate with these companies for better benefits and wages for our particular members. And you can see why at the time that's a good decision for the individual unions, the individual members, because you see these soaring increases in union take-home pay throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But what the 70s showed, and what the next few years will show once the economy turns back around, is that individual unions can't compete with the power of organized capital. Capital is just so much. They're smaller in the fact that all of them can get together in the same boardroom, and they can decide, okay, here's how we're going to move our capital in order to combat these workers who are asking for higher wages. The only way that workers can compete with that ability to coordinate and that ability to move money around the globe is by obtaining power in the state. The state is the only thing that can really battle companies like that. Only public power has enough has the ability to combat private power. If it's just unions without the power of the state, private power will crush them, and private power will often use the state to crush them. And so I wouldn't know what to tell the members exactly, other than that it's true that there's a lot of work now, but those bosses don't like paying high wages, and the second that they don't have to, they won't. And so in the 1970s, when you start to have this economic downturn starting in 73, labor was isolated. Labor had been going to war with the New Left. Labor was was supportive of, generally, it's not a monolith, but a lot of labor union folks supported the Vietnam War, which pissed off a lot of the rest of the Democratic Party. There was economic resentment over the way that union wages had risen higher than wages across the board, and there were genuine concerns about corruption in the ranks of the Teamsters at the time and some other big city unions. And so when the economy turned in 73, unions found themselves without the ability to protect themselves, because the New Left, like, look, you guys were just beating us in the street. So I'm sorry that you're getting crushed now by your bosses. That winds up being self-defeating for the New Left, and also defeating for labor. And so I would expect that the situation will be the same the next time there's an economic downturn, and businesses have an opportunity to bust unions and to lower wages. They will do it again, unless there's an alliance with enough elected officials who have enough power within the state or the federal government to push back against that and defend the rights of workers across the board, and including union members. But that's not very useful for 2020. But it's, yeah.
Right.
No, no.
Yeah, So, hypothesis. So if Biden wins the primary, I got to think Obama steps in, right? And that should help him with those third-party voters. Does that make sense, right?
Could, yeah. Yeah, it certainly could. I mean, I think, there are a lot of people on the left who think that Biden would lose. And I certainly think that that's possible, and Democrats shouldn't be complacent. But I see a lot of reason to think that he could beat Trump, too. I think that's a good example of why. He's an innocuous enough figure that the same people who dragged Nancy Pelosi, across the finish line into the speakership in 2018, not because they were absolutely impassioned for Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, but they were fired up for their country and for what they'd lost and to rebut Trump, that they could drag Joe Biden's old bones across the finish line too. And like you said, Obama will be out there, and we're talking at that point 5 months. So he just has to show some measure of vitality. I think it's certainly possible. And the case for him too would be that particularly in suburban Philadelphia, suburban Pittsburgh, suburban Milwaukee, suburban Detroit, these Republican voters who are kind of becoming more comfortable with voting Democratic would be less scared of Joe Biden than they would be of a Elizabeth Warren. Whereas the case for Sanders is different. The case for Sanders is that he's going to win enough of those white working class voters, which is a very plausible scenario too, that he can then lose some extra ones in the suburbs. But then the question on the other side is, can Trump bring out people who didn't vote in 2018 and didn't vote in 2016? And the numbers on that are interesting. I saw some data that the AFL-CIO, I think, put together, that there's this idea that if everybody voted, Democrats would just blow everybody away. That's not true in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, because the white working class population is such a significant portion of the non-voters. So despite all the people that he was able to bring out in 2016, there are still tens or hundreds of thousands of those folks who didn't vote in 2016 or 2018 that he seems to think he can animate by going hard at the squad, or who did he go at? I forget who he went after on Twitter today. He picked some racially charged angle of attack again today, that he thinks that there are enough people out there who he can pull out. And that's not impossible either.
Ryan, over here.
Where was that? Oh,
I hope you're right about Elizabeth Warren. My son tells me that, excuse me, my son tells me that the internet emails are going crazy. He's the chief data technician for her campaign. And he says he sees crazy momentum in a lot of people interested now in her. So he gives me a lot of updates of what's going on. So she's making a big push with the public. I don't know what states they're from. I was texting them to try to find out.
right.
But I hope they're in the 3 states that you say. I'll pass it on to him. But he's in charge of all the emails and data security. So I get a kind of an idea what's going on. So hope
Yeah,
you're
the,
right.
the energy has definitely turned in her direction, and it has turned commensurate with people's belief that she's electable. Like that seems to be the threshold thing. Like as she's risen, she's risen because people see her as someone who actually can beat Trump. So in this next debate on Thursday, if Biden can serve as a proxy for Trump for her, in other words, if she can cut down Biden in a way that convinces people that she could then cut down Trump in the same way, then she has a lot more room to grow if she can do it in a way that doesn't alienate Democratic partisans. That's the phenomenon that brought Kamala Harris that sugar high that she had very briefly. My take is that people saw her, slice and dice Biden on the stage, and they could then envision her doing the same thing to Trump on the debate stage, and then they say, oh, if she can do that, then she can win, and that lifts her poll numbers up. I suspect Kamala, though, is going to come pretty hard at Warren on Thursday, because interestingly, Warren's support has all kind of come from Kamala Harris mostly, which is really interesting. And interestingly, if you look at kind of where her polls started taking off, it's around the end of May, which happens to be like 3 or 4 weeks after people were saying that there was this Warren surge happening. But people just kept saying it, Warren surging, Warren surging, Warren surging, but it never was actually translating in increased poll numbers. And then the New York Times, I think it was May 28th, wrote a story saying that with all, plan by plan, Warren is surging. And there wasn't actually data to back that up at the time, but the Times wrote it anyway, and it created the surge. And then you start seeing it in the days after. The Warren campaign very wisely put a ton of money into spreading that. You can give Facebook money to make sure that everybody sees this New York Times article that says you're surging. And now all of a sudden, you actually are surging. And so when you look at her base of support at this point, that starts to explain why, when she has roughly the same political ideology as Bernie Sanders, the demographic makeup and class makeup of their support is totally different. And so you wonder, well, how on earth could that have possibly come about? It makes no sense. Are people really that dense? And it's like, oh, actually, no, Warren supporters are New York Times readers. And they read that article in the New York Times, and that convinced them that she was surging. That convinced them that therefore she's electable, because it's a self-affirming thing. And Warren has said this, the way you prove to people that you can win is by winning. That's what Obama did in 2008. He was getting 2% of the black vote heading into Iowa because they didn't believe that he could win, quite reasonably. But then he wins the whitest place ever, Iowa, and overnight, the numbers in the black community move, and everybody basically leaves Clinton and goes to Obama, and he demonstrated that the way you show that you can win is by actually winning. And so as she continues to rise, she's continuing to show that she can win. But ironically, I think if people go back and look at that moment, it could end up being completely pivotal, and arguably she wasn't actually moving yet at that point.
Well, hopefully after the debate, I can check in and see if her numbers are going up even more, because he quotes crazy momentum. So
Ask him about May 28th, May 29th.
Okay,
See if he notices a flat line and then a.
I will. He said no Russians, but that's okay.
Right. Ted?
How important do you think the pick of the vice president is for a Democrat to beat Donald Trump?
There, at least in the political science literature, there's no evidence that it really matters much. It's strange, but they can't find much. So it's really hard to say. The conventional wisdom is that Warren would pick somebody like Castro, or not somebody like Castro, but Castro, which feels almost like a 2024 strategy. Arizona is very close. Texas is very close, but they're always very close. They're never quite there. And the Hispanic, there's not a ton of Hispanic base to go after in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so then you start to ask, well, is the nominee going to try to pick somebody from those states? But then you don't have many people. Josh Shapiro is the AG of Pennsylvania and won in 2016, but he's a fairly boring kind of candidate, and nobody's ever heard of him. But he did win statewide in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman, fascinating. You know, he's the guy who's like the 6'8", bald-headed guy with a goatee that wears leather jackets and rides a motorcycle, and is the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. Very progressive guy. He might be too scary. But to pit up against Trump, that could be fascinating. Watching him debate Mike Pence would be amazing. You'd worry about Pence. There aren't a lot of figures in Michigan or Wisconsin either to pick from. So, you know, they probably, my guess would be they fall back on a diverse ticket, depending on who is the lead of it. I don't know, what do you think?
Being from Indiana, we're glad Mike Pence is the hell out. I tell you.
Wish he was still in Indiana. No offense.
I have a question. Over here to your right.
Okay.
Don't you think that Trump is more fearful of Joe Biden than any other candidate that's up there? 'Cause
That was the case, and so I talk pretty frequently to the Trump world as part of my reporting, and that was definitely the case for a very long time. That Trump in particular and some of the people closest to him felt like Biden was their biggest threat, and that all of their energy was spent on dragging Biden down. They don't think Sanders is necessarily a threat, though Trump is kind of flummoxed by him. Like if you ever watch Trump talk about Sanders, it's very odd because he's so good at, you know, annihilating his opponents with the cute nicknames or you know, just flicking them away. But when he gets to Sanders, he just kind of falls apart. There was this one great rally where he's like, Bernie Sanders, boy, that guy, he's got a lot of energy. And then it's like, well, but not the kind of energy you guys would like. He's Crazy Bernie. Like Crazy Bernie is a nickname for him. That's kind of, it's not really landing, especially from Donald Trump. But recently, the last several weeks, they have been getting extremely concerned about Elizabeth Warren. You know, they had thought that she was finished, and they were not at all worried about her. But that has utterly changed in my conversations with the Trump people. Now they see her rising. Partly it's coming back from the dead, just scares people. Like if you can come back from the dead, what else can you do? And they worry that her kind of economic populism cuts into Trump's version of it. Steve Bannon in particular is like extremely impressed with her version of what is she calls it economic patriotism. He calls his economic nationalism, and he's told people that, you know, that the thing that would, from his perspective, the thing that could undo her is if she leans too hard into the far left identity politics stuff and veers away from her economic patriotism. But if she sticks to that she's a huge threat. There's an interesting monologue that Tucker Carlson did that's worth Googling if you haven't seen it, where he reads a very long passage of a speech to his audience, and then he says, "Now, who do you think said that?" And he names some Republicans, and he's like, "No, it's not right. That was Elizabeth Warren." And I challenge you to find anything in the last 5 minutes that I read that you would disagree with. And then he says, you know, she's part of the trans socialist mob that's going to destroy America, so I don't support her. But you have to take this messaging seriously, and if the left embraces this kind of populism before the right does, then we're finished. It's a really interesting approach to her, and the Trump folks, Tucker Carlson and Trump talk a lot, actually. But the Trump folks are starting to worry a lot more about her. They still think Biden's a serious threat. And I think they also see the same poll numbers everybody else does, even if Trump refuses to acknowledge them. They see his approval numbers. And so they know that anybody who's nominated has at least a coin toss chance. So the numbers on that are interesting. The Twitter and to a lesser extent Facebook have amplified in our minds the loudest voices in a way that distorts our ability to kind of analyze these things dispassionately. In 2008, something like 20% of Democrats who voted for Hillary Clinton in the primary voted for John McCain in the general election. But Twitter and Facebook weren't a big thing yet, and they weren't terribly loud about it. They just went and did it. Whereas more than 90% of people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary ended up voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016. It's not perfect, but it's never going to be perfect. Like if you go back through all of the primaries throughout presidential history, you're going to have some small subset of people who prefer one candidate, and there's just nothing you can do to persuade them. But there has been more polling of that question that you're asking done this cycle than was done last cycle because I think because of all of the energy and attention around those Bernie Sanders supporters who so loudly either voted for Jill Stein or didn't vote at all. And at least the survey results show that in an overwhelming fashion, Democrats are going to consolidate around the nominee in a way that has almost no historical precedent. There will be some very loud people who will either vote third party or will vote for Trump out of spite, but they're going to be an extremely small number. And one major reason for that is not just that we've seen the Trump presidency, but that voters know now that it's going to be close, or they believe that it's going to be close. When people went to the polls in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania in 2016, they'd been told for months that the election was over. The election was over around the country, but in particular, it was over in those states. Though I don't think there was a poll that had Clinton winning any of those. That had Trump winning any of those states in the last month of the election, and then he goes and wins all three. And so people reasonably went in saying to themselves, well, he's going to win. The media's telling me he's going to win. She's going to win. Hillary's going to win. So she doesn't need my vote, so I hate her, so I'm going to vote for whatever. And so that dynamic is not in play this time. Like, people know that their vote is, or people believe that their vote is going to matter. So I think the answer to your question is very few. Very loud, but very few. And yeah, sure, that would be lovely. Yeah, so I'm happy to sign books out at the table out here. I hope you enjoy them.